Thank you for that introduction. Good day, everyone. For the next 15 minutes, we're going to be talking about pediatric exclusivity. I note that this presentation reflects my views and shouldn't be construed to represent FDA's views or policies. So over the next coming slides, we're going to be discussing the BPCA, the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, which created the pediatric exclusivity construct. We're going to talk about the basics of what it is and how it works. We're going to talk about PPSRs and written requests, the sponsor side and the FDA side of developing pediatric studies. We'll be discussing the requirements for sponsors to fairly respond to an FDA-generated written request if they want exclusivity. And at the end, I'll provide some resources, some challenge questions, and a recap overview of the 10,000-foot level of the process and components of pediatric exclusivity. So, pediatric exclusivity, what is it? Basically, like other exclusivities, it is a financial incentive for sponsors, and in this case, it's a financial incentive for sponsors to study drugs in children. It's appropriate under the statutory construct where information relating to the use of a new drug in the pediatric population may produce health benefits in that population. It is voluntary. Sponsors do not have to undertake the studies that are set forth by the agency as part of the pediatric written request process. This is in contrast to PREA studies under the Pediatric Research Equity Act, which can be required in some circumstances. And importantly, it's 6 months of additional exclusivity that's added to a sponsor's existing patent or exclusivity life. And the statute specifies that it needs to be a listed patent or NCE, 3-year, or orphan to solve a common problem, which is, historically, drugs were not often labeled for use in children. Children were often not included in clinical trials, and a lot of approved drugs lacked a pediatric indication. They lacked dosing information or safety information in children. There weren't a lot of pediatric formulations available. So, for instance, younger kids who couldn't swallow tablets or capsules would have a difficult time getting the medication they needed. And it was very common for clinicians to prescribe these drugs for off-label use in children without a lot of knowledge about what would happen if they did. Children were referred to as therapeutic orphans. So one solution was the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, which was created in 2002 and is codified in Section 505A of the FDA Act. It created pediatric exclusivity as an add-on incentive for drugs that had existing patent or exclusivity life, so usually new drugs. Importantly, it set forth a paradigm in which FDA determines which drug deserved to get the incentive. The statute established standards for written request, which is that information about the drug may produce health benefits in pediatric populations. It established that FDA needs to determine whether sponsors fairly respond to the written request, and it specified that the FDA determination about the fairly respond needs to be made at least 9 months before the expiration of the patent or exclusivity life to which the extra 6 months would attach. The intent, of course, was to have more drugs studied in and labeled for use in children. This is in contrast to the Pediatric Research Equity Act, or PREA, which was enacted a year later and codified at Section 505B of the FDA Act. Under PREA, pediatric studies are required for certain applicants. Specifically, original applications or supplements for a new active ingredient, new indication, new dosing form, new dosing regimen, or a new route of administration have to submit assessments conducted in pediatric populations with their marketing application. Also, original applications for certain adult oncology drugs, that is, oncology drugs for an adult indication, wherein the drug has a molecular target FDA determines to be substantially relevant to the growth or progression of a pediatric cancer, are required to conduct pediatric investigations. Importantly, those investigations are required to be conducted on the pediatric cancer and not the adult cancer. PREA had a similar intent, however. Congress wanted to get more drugs studied and labeled for use in children. So the BPCA process, the pediatric exclusivity process, is shown here in this chart. At the beginning, a sponsor can submit a PPSR, a proposed pediatric study request, which we'll talk about later, but that is optional. Sponsors don't have to do it. And FDA makes an initial determination whether information relating to the use of a drug may produce health benefits in children. If the answer is no, FDA doesn't issue a written request. But if the answer is yes, then FDA may choose, doesn't have to, but may choose to issue a written request to a sponsor. The sponsor has 180 days to make a decision about whether or not it wants to accept the written request and proceed with studies. If they say no, then, according to the statute, FDA needs to consult with NIH to determine whether engaging with NIH to do further studies is appropriate. If the sponsor accepts within 180 days, however, and they go forth and conduct the studies, they submit the reports according to the written request timeline, then FDA has another determination to make, which is, did the sponsor fairly respond to the written request? If the answer to that question is no, well, too bad, no exclusivity. But if the answer is yes, and certain other conditions are met, then the sponsor gets a grant of the additional 6 months of exclusivity. So PPSRs, proposed pediatric study plans, which I just mentioned, these are sponsor submissions to the FDA. They describe the proposed studies that the sponsor wants to do. They request the issuance of the written request, and they are entirely optional. A sponsor can still receive a written request without submitting a PPSR. They just have to wait for FDA to make the determination of its own accord. All the PPSRs that come in are required to be reviewed by the Pediatric Review Committee, or the PIRC, and FDA has 120 days to respond to a sponsor PPSR. They'll respond in one or two ways. First, they'll agree and say, yeah, okay, we'll issue you a written request, or they'll send back what we call a PPSR inadequate letter, explaining to the sponsor why what they have proposed is not appropriate for a written request. The written request is really the heart of the pediatric exclusivity incentive structure. FDA may issue a pediatric written request if it determines that information relating to the use of a new drug in the pediatric population may produce health benefits in that population. A written request can include multiple indications, whether approved or unapproved, and it can be issued at any time during drug development. A written request is absolutely required for pediatric exclusivity. A sponsor can't just conduct pediatric studies and then ask for the incentive. Any studies that are conducted must be done pursuant to an FDA-issued written request. Written requests are all reviewed according to the statute by the Pediatric Review Committee, or PIRC for short. There is a consultation involved in the pediatric written request process, and the sponsor must accept or reject any written requests it receives within 180 days. When FDA decides to issue a written request, it will take into account adequate representation of children of ethnic and racial minorities. It'll include neonates, or it'll explain why neonates are not included in the study request, and it will include a request for the sponsor to propose labeling that results from those pediatric studies. Studies conducted pursuant to the written request have their own sets of requirements, some of which include that they have to be conducted with an appropriate pediatric formulation for each age group under study. They have to be submitted in accordance with the timeline set forth in the written request. And once they are submitted, FDA has 180 days to review them and to make an exclusivity determination. Now, the statute sets forth several different requirements as part of the pediatric exclusivity incentive, and some of them I mentioned on the previous slide. So, for example, it's important to make sure that the studies were conducted with the appropriate pediatric formulation, that they were conducted in accordance with commonly accepted scientific principles and protocols, that they were submitted in accordance with the written request timelines, and that they were reported in accordance with filing requirements. Perhaps the most challenging question for FDA in the determination of whether a sponsor should get pediatric exclusivity is the question of whether the sponsor fairly responded to the written request. And this is something that FDA is required by statute to determine. There are two ways to do this. The first, which is often referred to as prong 1, is when the sponsor meets all of the terms of the written request exactly. The second, often referred to as prong 2, is where the sponsor provides clinically meaningful information across all age groups and uses cited in the written request, even if perfect compliance is not achieved. It's important to note also that the statute specifies that as of the date FDA makes the determination about whether the sponsor fairly responded, there have to be at least 9 months of patent or exclusivity life left. If there are fewer than 9 months left, then the sponsor is forbidden from getting pediatric exclusivity. Given how valuable 6 months of exclusivity can be, it will probably surprise no one that there are some additional expectations and statutory requirements that apply to either FDA or sponsors. So, for example, FDA is required to order that study information be added to a drug's labeling. Whether the studies are positive or negative or inconclusive, it doesn't matter. The important thing is that the information get out to patients and clinicians. Labeling supplements containing this information, though, are going to get priority review, which means they'll have a 6-month target date instead of a 10-month date. And the hope, again, is to speed this information to the people who need it as quickly as possible. It's really important to note that sponsors of a safe and effective pediatric formulation who fail to market that formulation within a year of getting pediatric exclusivity are required by statute to go on a public list. This is helpful because it helps those that are interested in the pediatric space understand the choices that sponsors are making and really helps with sponsor accountability. FDA is also required to publicly post certain information pertaining to pediatric labeling, some reviews of pediatric studies, and some information about which sponsors received pediatric exclusivity. So, we've arrived at challenge question number 1. Which of the following is necessary for FDA to issue a written request? A, a proposed pediatric study request. B, a determination that information about the drug may produce health benefits in pediatric populations. Or C, a user fee equivalent to that required for an original marketing application. The answer is B, a determination that information about the drug may produce health benefits in pediatric populations. This is the statutory requirement for FDA to issue a written request. Challenge question number 2. Which of the following is not necessary for FDA to grant exclusivity? A, at least 9 months remaining of qualifying patent or exclusivity life. B, an FDA determination that a sponsor fairly responded to the written request. C, studies that were conducted using an appropriate pediatric formulation. Or D, studies that were submitted within 1 year of a timeline specified in the written request. The answer is D, studies that were submitted within 1 year of the timeline specified in the written request. If you submit your studies a year too late, you're too late. So this slide I hope will be a helpful tool for all of you. It's the overview slide regarding the pediatric exclusivity process. It helps show from a 10,000-foot level roughly how the process works and roughly what some of the highlights of the standards for getting pediatric exclusivity are. If you have any questions, I'd suggest asking them at the upcoming panel discussion or checking out these 2 web pages, which contain helpful information to better understand the pediatric exclusivity construct. Thanks so much for your time. I appreciate your attention. And now I'll pass the microphone to my colleague, Erin Friedman.
Thank you, Kristiana. Hi, everyone. My name is Erin Friedman. I'm a Senior Regulatory Counsel in the Office of Orphan Products Development. Today, I'll be presenting about orphan drug exclusivity. After this presentation, you should be able to define the term orphan drug, describe the scope of orphan drug exclusivity, identify when clinical superiority needs to be demonstrated, and locate orphan drug exclusivity information on OOPD's website and the Orange Book. The Orphan Drug Act was passed in 1983 to facilitate the development of drugs and biologics for rare diseases. It was thought that due to the small patient population of such diseases, a sponsor would need financial incentives to pursue development. Without these incentives, the drug may be orphaned and not developed. The Orphan Drug Act created a designation process by which FDA can designate a drug as a drug intended for a rare disease or condition. Once designated, these drugs may be eligible for certain financial incentives. The Orphan Drug Act defines rare disease in two ways. First, a disease that affects less than 200,000 people in the United States. Second, a disease that affects more than 200,000 people in the United States, but there is no reasonable expectation that the cost of developing and making available the drug in the US will be recovered from sales of the drug in the US. We call this the cost recovery definition, and it's very uncommon that a sponsor requests designation under this provision and that FDA has granted designation under this provision. Most of all the orphan designations that have been granted have been for the first definition of rare disease. The incentives associated with orphan drug designation include a 25% tax credit for qualified clinical trials, a waiver of the marketing application user fee, grants to support studies for orphan products, and potential for 7-year orphan drug exclusivity, also known as ODE. Not all of these incentives were created or outlined by the Orphan Drug Act, but they come from other parts of the law and can change over time. There is a two-step process to be eligible for orphan drug exclusivity: designation and approval. First, a sponsor must request orphan drug designation prior to submitting a marketing application for the drug. FDA will grant designation to a sponsor for their drug if that drug is intended to treat a rare disease or condition. Designation is for the whole disease, regardless of how the sponsor may end up studying the drug. If the drug is designated and then approved for an indication covered by the designation, it may be eligible for orphan drug exclusivity. Note that often the approved indication is narrower than the overall disease for which the drug is designated. In addition, to be eligible for orphan drug exclusivity, it must be the first approval for that drug for that indication. Otherwise, the sponsor must demonstrate that its drug is clinically superior to the other same drugs approved for the same indication. We'll talk more about clinical superiority in a little bit. Now, what is the scope of orphan drug exclusivity? As in, what does it protect? For 7 years from approval, FDA cannot approve another sponsor's application for the same drug for the same use or indication unless the subsequent drug is clinically superior. Let's take each of these elements one by one. The types of applications that orphan drug exclusivity can block include applications under Section 505 of the FD&C Act and Section 351 of the Public Health Service Act. That means orphan drug exclusivity could block NDAs, such as 505B1s or B2s, ANDAs, and BLAs. Under orphan drug exclusivity, FDA cannot approve another sponsor's application for the same drug. The orphan drug regulations define same drug in two ways. For drugs composed of small molecules, same drug means the same active moiety. For drugs composed of large molecules, the same drug means same principal molecular structural features. The orphan drug regulations also say that if a subsequent drug is clinically superior, it is no longer considered the same drug. Under orphan drug exclusivity, FDA may not approve another sponsor's application for the same drug for the same use or indication. Indication is defined by the marketing approval. If the approved indication is narrower than the overall disease, the orphan drug exclusivity only blocks the approved indication and not the other parts of the disease that may not be covered by that indication. I have mentioned that there are certain circumstances where a sponsor may need to demonstrate that its drug is clinically superior to other versions of the same drug. The orphan drug regulations define clinical superiority as a significant therapeutic advantage by way of greater effectiveness, greater safety, or a major contribution to patient care. Note that this definition of clinical superiority is just for the purposes of orphan designation and exclusivity and does not apply to other parts of the agency. There are two distinct times clinical superiority may need to be demonstrated. First, if there is existing orphan drug exclusivity, and a different sponsor submits an application for the same drug for the same indication, that application cannot be approved unless the sponsor can break exclusivity by demonstrating that its drug is clinically superior to the drug with orphan drug exclusivity. Second, if FDA approves a designated drug, and the same drug has already been approved for the same use or indication, in order for the new approval to be eligible for orphan drug exclusivity, the sponsor must demonstrate that its drug is clinically superior to all already approved same drugs for the same indication. There are also two exceptions to orphan drug exclusivity. First, if a sponsor cannot assure sufficient quantities of its drug to meet the needs of patients with a rare disease or condition, there is a process by which FDA can approve another same drug for the same indication despite orphan drug exclusivity. Second, a sponsor with orphan drug exclusivity can choose to waive that exclusivity in general or for specific other applications. Putting all of this together, orphan drug exclusivity lasts 7 years from approval. FDA cannot approve another sponsor's application for the same drug for the same use or indication unless the subsequent drug is clinically superior to the drug holding exclusivity. Now I'm going to show you two ways that you can look up orphan drug exclusivity information online. First, on the OOPD website at the link provided here, you can search for all orphan drug designations granted and all orphan drug approvals. Here, you can also see information about orphan drug exclusivity. For this example, I used the approved products search and searched by the active moiety gavosaran. There was one result for gavosaran, and that is for the product with the trade name Givlari. You can see that gavosaran was granted orphan drug designation for the treatment of acute hepatic porphyria, AHP, on August 29, 2016. Then, on November 20, 2019, FDA approved Givlari for the treatment of adults with AHP. Note that this is an example of the approved labeled indication being narrower than the orphan designated disease because the approval was only for adults with the disease. The search results also include a column called Exclusivity Protected Indication. Usually, the exclusivity protected indication is the same as the approved labeled indication, as it is here. However, at times they may differ depending on the situation. For example, hypothetically, if there were a subsequent approval that expanded the indication to include pediatric patients, the approved labeled indication may read that the drug is approved for the treatment of adults and pediatric patients with AHP. This subsequent approval may be eligible for orphan drug exclusivity, but the exclusivity protected indication would only be the new part of the indication, which just covers pediatric patients. In that case, the exclusivity protected indication would read for the treatment of pediatric patients with AHP, which would differ from the approved labeled indication. The OOPD website has lots of useful information, and I encourage you to explore the search functions. You can also see orphan drug exclusivity information in the Orange Book. Here, I've searched for the same active moiety, gavosaran, on the Orange Book website and then navigated to the Patent and Exclusivity Information section. You will see there is one ODE code. And if you hover over the code, you will see the exclusivity protected indication pop up, treatment of adults with AHP. The Orange Book also lists the exclusivity expiration date of November 20th, 2026. All of this information should be consistent with the OOPD website. Now I'm going to ask two challenge questions. First, ODE means that FDA cannot approve another sponsor's application for the same drug for any indication, the same drug for the same indication, the same drug for the same orphan disease, or any drug for the same indication? The answer is the same drug for the same indication. When a sponsor has orphan drug exclusivity, FDA cannot approve the same drug for the same indication unless the subsequent drug is clinically superior. Challenge question 2. Orphan drug exclusivity lasts for how long? 3 years from the date of designation, 7 years from the date of designation, 3 years from the date of approval, or 7 years from the date of approval? The answer is D, 7 years from the date of approval. In summary, the first step of being eligible for orphan drug exclusivity is obtaining orphan drug designation. Under orphan drug exclusivity, FDA cannot approve another sponsor's application for the same drug for the same indication. There are certain situations under which a sponsor may need to demonstrate clinical superiority, either to break orphan exclusivity or to be eligible for orphan exclusivity in their own right. And finally, orphan drug exclusivity information is listed on OOPD's website and in the Orange Book. If you have any questions, feel free to email us at orphan@fda.hhs.gov or visit our website at fda.gov/orphan. Thank you very much for your attention. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Katie Schumann, who is going to cover GAIN exclusivity.
Hi, my name is Katie Schumann. I'm the Deputy Director in the Division of Regulatory Policy, Office of New Drug Policy, and CDER FDA. And today, I'm going to talk to you about GAIN exclusivity. First, a few disclaimers. This presentation reflects my views and not the views or policies of FDA. The presentation will give an overview of GAIN exclusivity, but for regulatory decisions, definitely refer to the relevant statutory provisions of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Next, we'll go over the learning objectives for the session today. By the end of the session, I hope that you'll be able to describe the criteria for designating a drug product as a qualified infectious disease product, or QIDP, that you should be able to list the types of exclusivity that can be extended by GAIN. You should be able to explain the impact of the GAIN exclusivity extension on the submission of abbreviated new drug applications, or ANDAs, and 505(b)(2) NDAs. And finally, you should recognize how the GAIN exclusivity extension is presented in FDA's Orange Book. So I'll go ahead and start with a brief overview of the GAIN Act. Generating Antibiotic Incentives Now, or GAIN, was signed into law in 2012 as Title VIII of the Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act. As a response to the growing threat of antimicrobial resistance and a small pipeline of new antimicrobial drugs, it created incentives to encourage the development of new antibacterial and antifungal drugs for serious infections. The benefits of GAIN include fast-track designation, priority review for the first application submitted, and a 5-year exclusivity extension, which will be the main focus of the presentation today. The incentives of GAIN are generally available to certain products designated as qualified infectious disease products. The law allows FDA to designate drug products as QIDPs, provided that the sponsor can demonstrate that the proposed product is an antibacterial or antifungal drug for human use that is intended to treat serious or life-threatening infections. QIDP designation applies to a specific sponsor who makes the request for their specific drug product and for the use for which the product is being studied. Designation doesn't apply to the active ingredient in general or any sponsor developing that drug. One important thing to also note is that QIDP designation and GAIN only apply to drug products that are submitted to the agency under a new drug application, or NDA. GAIN doesn't apply to biologics that are submitted to FDA in biologics license applications. And lastly, to date, the agency has granted over 200 QIDP designations to individual drug products, and that number is growing all the time. As I mentioned before, the primary incentive provided by GAIN is a 5-year extension of exclusivity. That extension is added to any exclusivity for which the application qualifies for upon approval. Specifically, there are 3 kinds of exclusivity that can be extended by GAIN. The first is New Chemical Entity, or NCE exclusivity, for a period of 5 years. The second is New Clinical Investigation exclusivity, which lasts for a period of 3 years. And the last is Orphan Drug exclusivity, for a duration of 7 years. When these types of exclusivity are extended by GAIN, the GAIN extension assumes the scope of the underlying exclusivity, whatever that may be. Finally, you should be aware of some important statutory limitations to the GAIN exclusivity extension that are described in much more detail in FDA's draft guidance on QIDP designation. Primarily, the extension doesn't apply to efficacy supplements if the NDA has already received a GAIN extension. Similarly, a subsequent application for changes to a previously approved product that received a 5-year extension will not be eligible in certain circumstances, as further described in the guidance. Finally, a GAIN exclusivity extension cannot apply if the application of the supplement doesn't qualify for any underlying exclusivity to begin with. This slide is a graphic example of how the GAIN exclusivity extension applies to the underlying exclusivity. This figure shows NCE, New Clinical Investigation, and Orphan Drug exclusivity extended by GAIN. As I mentioned on the last slide, the extension takes on the scope of the underlying exclusivity. For example, a GAIN extension of Orphan Drug exclusivity would bar FDA from approving the same drug for the same orphan disease or condition protected by the underlying Orphan Drug exclusivity for a period of 12 years. That is the 7 years of underlying Orphan Drug exclusivity plus the 5-year GAIN extension. For NCE exclusivity extended by GAIN, FDA is barred from accepting for review an ANDA or a B2 application for a drug containing the same active moiety for a period of 10 years if there is no paragraph 4 certification submitted, or a period of 9 years if a paragraph 4 certification is provided. This next graphic displays how the 6-month pediatric exclusivity extension stacks onto the GAIN exclusivity extension for each of the types of underlying exclusivity previously discussed. Finally, here we display an example of how the GAIN exclusivity extension is shown in FDA's Orange Book. The example here is the product Kristiana capsules, which upon approval qualified for NCE exclusivity as well as 2 different periods of orphan exclusivity for 2 different conditions. The 305 code is for the treatment of invasive aspergillosis, and the 90 code is for the treatment of invasive mucormycosis. The underlying exclusivity period is displayed first, followed by the GAIN extension below, which as you can see is marked with an asterisk and the word GAIN next to it. The expiration period to the right reflects when the extension expires. So for this NDA approval that occurred on March 6, 2015, the GAIN extended NCE exclusivity expires 10 years later on March 6, 2025. And the GAIN extended orphan periods expire 12 years later on March 6, 2027. So that's it for the content of the presentation. Now I'd like to move to some challenge questions for you. The first question is, which of the following types of exclusivity cannot be extended by GAIN exclusivity? The answer choices are A, 5-year NCE exclusivity, B, 3-year New Clinical Investigation exclusivity, C, 180-day exclusivity, or D, Orphan Drug exclusivity. So the correct answer here is 180-day exclusivity, and that is because 180-day exclusivity applies only to ANDAs and not to NDAs and is therefore unaffected by GAIN. And now we'll move on to challenge question number 2. What is the total period for orphan drug exclusivity with a GAIN extension? The answer choices are A, 8 years, B, 10 years, C, 11 years, or D, 12 years. And the correct answer to this one is 12 years. That's the 7 years of orphan drug exclusivity plus the 5-year GAIN extension. And now I'll leave you with a few resources on GAIN exclusivity and GAIN in general. First, the FDA Act citation to GAIN. Next, a link to FDA's draft guidance for industry on QIDP designation, which, when finalized, will represent the agency's current thinking. And finally, the February 2018 HHS report to Congress on the GAIN Act. So if you have any questions about GAIN or GAIN exclusivity, there will be a Q&A session coming up shortly, and I'd be happy to answer your questions at that time. Thanks very much.